Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, my name is Saurabh Sharma and we are doing Introduction to Chinese Studies course. Today we are going to do lecture number 8, Century of Humiliation, Discourse on Imperialism, Part 2. In the 7th lecture, we had done Part 1 of this lecture. So, this is a map of the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty was a Manchu dynasty. Okay, so, their original homeland is this area, as you can see, Manchuria. So, from here they expanded into this pink area, okay, and build a very strong state. This is the Great Wall of China. The south of the Great Wall of China was the Ming dynasty. So, the Manchus, they eventually in the 17th century they captured the rest of China. Okay, so the Ming Empire was eliminated and China became part of the Qing Empire. The green parts are those territories like Taiwan and Tibet and Outer Mongolia, deep into Central Asia, okay, Xinjiang. All these provinces were gradually one by one captured by the Manchus. So, they built the largest Chinese empire perhaps after the Mongol Empire, okay, and Manchus are very closely related ethnically with the Mongols. So, Manchus and Mongols were jointly the elite that ruled over China during the Qing dynasty period. There you can see there are some countries which are in light orange color, for example, Korea or Vietnam, Laos, even Nepal, Burma, Siam. So, according to the Chinese view, these countries were part of the tributary system. Korea definitely was, Vietnam also was. Other countries, it's a Chinese claim. From time to time, they might have paid some tribute to China. For example, in case of Nepal, there was a war between Nepal and China because the Gurkhas had invaded Tibet, and to protect Tibet, the Chinese had sent their troops and they marched into Nepalese territory, and so there was an agreement between them. And so, for a few years, Nepal did pay tribute to the Chinese court. So, anyone in any point of history, if they had paid a tribute to the Chinese emperor, they claim it to be part of the Chinese tributary system. So, this was the might of the Qing Empire, and I have already told you about Qianlong Emperor, okay, who refused to accept the offer made by the McCartney mission which was sent by King George III. Now, at that time, of course, that was 1793, China was a mighty power. It was in terms of population the largest empire in the world. It also had the largest GDP in the world, almost more than 30%. But gradually Chinese power began to decline relative to the Europeans, because European powers were industrializing. Britain had already had the first industrial revolution in the late 18th century. In the mid 19th century, Britain had the second industrial revolution. Now, the century of humiliation period starts in, say, you can say it starts with 1842 Treaty of Nanjing, when the Chinese were defeated by the British in the first Opium War, and they signed a humiliating Treaty of Nanjing. I have already given you the details of those period, what were the various treaties and what happened. Let us look briefly at the different rulers of China during that time, during this period of the early part of the century of humiliation. Tao Kuang, the grandson of Qianlong, he was the emperor during the first Opium War. He was succeeded by his son Xianfeng, okay, who was the ruler of China during the second Opium War, when joint Anglo-French forces they defeated China, and China again had to sign very humiliating treaties, not only with France and Britain, but also with America and Russia. Once Xianfeng died, he was succeeded by his son Tongzhi, but Tongzhi was a young boy, and therefore he did not assume power directly. Instead, he was under the regency, and one of the reasons was Dowager Cixi, his mother. Okay. So, Dowager Cixi during this period from 1861 onwards was the most powerful political figure in China. She basically controlled who will be the emperor of China, and she even replaced emperors as a will, and she did not give up power. If when the emperor came of age, she did not give up power to them. She was supported by a group of very conservative civil servants, the mandarins, on whose advice she basically functioned. Now, let us see. So, Tongzhi by 1875 came of age, and he decided to directly play a role in the politics of China, but he was not very successful. Within a year he died, and he was then replaced by Guangxu. Guangxu was not his son, because he died childless, he did not have a son, and so Guangxu was a nephew of Dowager Cixi, her sister's son. So, she made him the next emperor, and he was also a young boy, so he also did not exercise much power. When he came of age in 1898, he tried to exercise power, he tried to reform China, but soon he was arrested and put under house arrest. Although he was the emperor of China, for the next 10 years he was under house arrest, and Dowager Cixi was basically running the government. And when Dowager Cixi was about to die, a day before, she poisoned Guangxu, and Guangxu died, and the next day she replaced him with Puyi. Puyi was 3 years old, and he was made the emperor of China. The next day, Dowager Cixi died, and Puyi ruled China for a few more years. He was known as the Shuangtong emperor. Okay, so he ruled for four more years, and then in the Xinhai revolution he was overthrown and Republic of China was established. So, throughout the period of all these rulers, China was declining. It was defeated one by one by foreign powers who took more and more concessions from China, and China practically became a semi-colonial state. Semi-colonial basically means that it was not fully colonized like India. India, for example, was mostly ruled by the British, while China mostly was under its own indigenous rule, but in its coastal areas the foreign powers had their influence. Okay, so this is a very famous cartoon published in 1898. So, this is China is the pie here, you can see this is the pie China. This is a French cartoon, so it is written in French, and this pie is being shared by these different rulers. Okay, this is Queen Victoria, this is Kaiser William II, Tsar Nicholas II. Okay, this is the representation of France, Marianne, and this is a Japanese samurai. Okay, so they are basically practically dividing China, splitting China among themselves. This is Chinese Mandarin shouting and protesting. Okay, so I have already discussed, so but let me show you in the map. So basically, due to those unequal treaties, this whole area came under control of Russia. So Russia was able to take over this area from China, also this part, this area. Okay, all these areas came under the control of Russia. Later on Soviet Union, so Soviet Union replaced Russia. Anyhow, so Outer Mongolia, again this Russia made it an independent country, Mongolia, under its own domination. Then the British from this from Hong Kong all the way to Shanghai, it enjoyed control here. France, it controlled Vietnam and Laos. This is called Indochina. This area was controlled by the French, and also the southern parts of China were under its sphere of influence. Even the Germans played a role. Kaiser William, as you saw in the cartoon. So in Shantung, Germany also established a sphere of influence. But the biggest share was taken by Japan. Okay, it annexed Korea completely. 1910, Korea became part of Japanese Empire. Taiwan and all these islands, this whole area was occupied by Japan, and then Japan had its eyes on the rest of China. Okay, we shall see how Japan continued its policy of colonizing China. Okay, so this is sharing the Chinese pie. Now I have already discussed these points, beginning with the first Opium War and all those treaties which granted different rights to the foreign powers. we discuss up to the situation in Tibet. Okay, so Tibet here was very important for the British, not because say they had territorial ambitions in Tibet, because the British were afraid that, you can see, the Russian Empire was expanding. Okay, it was moving towards the south. Okay, it was looking for a warm water access, okay, towards Tibet and towards Afghanistan. So, as a part of the great game, the British wanted to stop the Russians from threatening their empire in India, and therefore they decided to intervene in Afghanistan as well as in Tibet to stop the Russians from attacking India. And so, for this purpose, the British sent young husband expedition to Tibet, where they threatened the Dalai Lama, who escaped from there, and they were able to install some of their military assets there. And eventually, after the collapse of the Qing Empire, when China became republic and it was very weak, in 1914 there was a convention in Shimla, in which basically they demarcated the boundary between their empire in India and Tibet. That is known as McMahon Line today. But it also, the convention also divided Tibet into two parts, inner Tibet and outer Tibet. So, inner Tibet was supposed to be directly under the jurisdiction of China, while outer Tibet was supposed to be de facto independent, but under the suzerainty of China. So, China would be considered to be the sovereign power there, but they would have maximum autonomy and also protection from the British. So, the Chinese believe all these to be unequal treaties, and therefore, you see, China does not recognize the boundary between India and China. There is a dispute because China does not accept the validity of the Shimla Convention, although the Chinese representative who had come had initialed the treaty, but it was not ratified by the Chinese government. Okay. So, every treaty has to be ratified by the government, and so that was not done, and therefore, China is not a signatory of the Shimla Convention. Only the government of Tibet and the British Indian government were the signatories. Okay, so we have done this. Now, so far what we have discussed, let's look at some of these concepts that we have discussed so far. The first is colonialism and imperialism. So, colonialism means when one country goes into another far off place, tries to settle its own people, establish economic interest, military control, and make that territory into its own colony. Okay, that process is known as colonialism. In colonialism, the colonial power exploits the economic resources of the colony for its own benefit. As a result, the colony's economy declines and the colonizer is enriched. That is the process of colonialism. Imperialism is the next stage, when big empires are created. So, there are a number of colonies which are administered through the imperial system. So, a viceroy, a governor general is appointed who rules over that particular territory. So, there was the British Empire, the French Empire, so on and so forth, different European empires. So, this is known as imperialism. Then we also talked about the great game. Okay, again we must go to the map here. The great game was played between great powers. Okay. So, in Tibet and Afghanistan, it was between Russia and Britain, and Britain did well. It was able to stop Russia from interfering in Afghanistan and Tibet, but for a few decades the Russian threat was very real for the British. Similarly, there was this conflict between Russia and Japan. I told you that Russia occupied this territory in Manchuria. Now, Japan also wanted to have its power in Manchuria. So, Vladivostok is somewhere here, which is an important port and naval base for the Russians. Okay, so the Japanese felt threatened by it. Okay, and so that eventually led to the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, when Russia was defeated by Japan and it was able to extend its influence into Manchuria at the cost of the Russians. Okay, so all these contests between great powers is known as the great game. The other important concept is heartland versus maritime strategies. Heartland refers to a strategy based on land-based army, land-based weapons, and expanding your land territory. So, countries like say Germany and Russia primarily had an heartland strategy. They wanted to protect their own country. As a result, they wanted to create buffer between themselves and other great powers by expanding more and more, capturing more and more territory, thus securing the heartland. On the other hand, maritime strategy is a naval strategy. So the great naval powers like Britain, or before them the Dutch or the Portuguese and Spain and the French, they had very powerful navies. So their own territory was very small, it was limited, but they expanded their power by going into different parts of the world and colonizing them. So that is the maritime strategy. Japan also, because its land is also limited, also followed a maritime strategy. And often what happens in geopolitics is a maritime power comes into conflict with a heartland power. So the British Empire coming in conflict with the German Empire, or the Japanese coming in conflict with, as I told you, Russian Empire, or China. China was also a heartland empire. Or in the Cold War, it was Soviet Union versus the Americans. Americans followed a maritime strategy because within their own continent, America was not threatened. Okay, they were safe. It was overseas that the Americans fought against the Soviets, while the Soviets were fighting in the territories around themselves. Okay, so that is the heartland and maritime strategy. So in this, Japan was the maritime power which colonized parts of China, which was the heartland power. Next, unequal treaties. Unequal treaties are those treaties which are signed by a strong state and a weak state. So when a state is very weak, if you force that state to sign a treaty and concede a lot of things to them, these are known as unequal treaties. So according to the Chinese, all these treaties that were signed during the century of humiliation, like Treaty of Nanjing or Bogue or Whampoa or Wangxia, or the Tianjin treaties, or the Convention of Peking, and so all these treaties, or the biggest one was Treaty of Shimonoseki. Okay, so all these treaties are considered to be unequal treaties because at that time China was weak. China unwillingly gave up a lot of things to foreign powers. Okay, so these are called unequal treaties. Once China stood on its own, it rejected all the unequal treaties and said that they will not accept them. Then we talked about treaty ports. Okay, treaty ports are those ports which were given to foreign powers by China, where the foreigners come and do business. And in these treaty ports, there was extraterritoriality, that for example, there is a British subject, that subject won't be governed by Chinese laws. So although that subject is living in China, the law governing them will be British laws, and they will be judged by British judges, not by Chinese judges, or Chinese government cannot prosecute them. Only the British government can do. Same for the French, same for the Russians, Americans. Such treaty ports were created all over China. If you remember, the first 5 treaty ports were Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningpo and Shanghai, okay, which are given to the British by the Chinese. So these are treaty ports. Extraterritoriality I have already explained. Then another thing the foreign powers asked for was most favored nation status, that they will be given very good trade deal and no other country will be given a better deal than them. So most favored nation status these days is applicable in WTO. If you are a member of WTO, you offer most favored nation status to other members of WTO. This is a kind of a practice of free trade. So wherever there is free trade, there has to be most favored nation status. The number 8 is sphere of influence. So these great powers in these great games, they preyed upon smaller states and created sphere of influence. So sphere of influence means that particular area is not directly ruled by the great power, but whatever government it has is not completely independent. It is subject to the will of the great power. Okay, so say for example Korea. So Korea was under the sphere of influence of the Chinese Empire till 1895, when they surrendered Korea and gave it to Japan, and it came under Japanese sphere of influence. 1910, Japan annexed Korea. Till 1910, it was under its sphere of influence. Or say Indochina. Indochina was under the Chinese sphere of influence. France then, after the war with China, they brought Indochina under their own sphere of influence. So this is the concept of sphere of influence. Or say Tibet being the sphere of influence of the British. Okay, so here we have understood these different concepts. Now, how did the Chinese respond to imperialism? They were defeated one by one by different powers. So were they ready to change? So, they adopted certain policies. The first was the self-strengthening movement. This was adopted in 1861 after the Convention of Peking, when they were defeated by these foreign powers. They realized that they have to westernize. Okay, so they started importing foreign machines. They established factories, weapon factories. They started adopting Western training for their military. Okay, and so there was an attempt to completely change the way military is organized in China, but they did not change the culture. So basically, in the self-strengthening movement, they said culture will remain the same. So they will continue to follow the Confucian system with the civil service exam and all that, but technologically they will learn from the West. So they divided the whole learning process into two: technical education from the West, but cultural education from China. In fact, self-strengthening movement was quite useful for some time. Prince Kung was one of the most important supporters of this, and because of his efforts, a large number of people were able to work on this, and the number of factories came up and so on. Eventually, Prince Kung, his power declined in the Chinese court. As a result, self-strengthening movement began to lose support. Ultimately, when Japan defeated China within 6 months, and China could not win even a single battle against Japan, it was completely humiliated. That basically sidelined all the supporters of self-strengthening movement. So the conservatives, in the court, they led by Dowager Cixi, they argued that the westernization plans have all failed, and therefore we must return to the old ways. Okay. For example, Li Hongzhang, who was an important supporter of self-strengthening movement, he was sent to Shimonoseki to sign the treaty with Japan, and he was in the bargaining he lost a lot, and so once he returned, he was humiliated. His power declined. In fact, some people considered it to be an insult to be called Li Hongzhang. Okay. One of the important institutions of the self-strengthening movement was Zhongli Yamen. Zhongli Yamen was the foreign ministry of China, or say whoever was the head of this institution was considered to be equal to the post of prime minister. They basically dealt with all the foreign powers. Okay, so this movement lasted for about 3 decades. Then the conservatives took hold. Now at that time, some young radical thinkers also emerged. For example, Kang Youwei and his student Liang Qichao. Okay, so these were very radical thinkers. They wanted to liberalize China, wanted to make it into a westernized kind of a constitutional monarchy with universities, modern schools, modern way of life, and so on and so forth. And Emperor Guangxu by that time had come of age. It is 1898, and he decided to take power in his own hands, and he introduced what is known as 100 days reform, supported by the reformers. But Dowager Cixi was not happy with this, and after 100 days he was arrested, and the reformers were all executed except Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, because they escaped to Japan, but others who were in China were all arrested and executed by the conservatives. Unfortunately for the conservatives, the situation was worsening, and after the Boxer rebellion, when China was again humiliated by the invasion of 8 nations, even the conservatives decided that it is time for reforms. And so Dowager Cixi and upcoming military leaders like Yuan Shikai, they started reforming the Qing government, but it was too late, and the whole Confucian system had collapsed, it had failed, and the civil service exams were abolished. But eventually the Qing dynasty was overthrown in 1911. By 1912, China became a republic. So let us look at the situation after China became a republic. So in 1914, the First World War broke out. So Germany was the enemy, Japan joined the allies, so they joined Britain, so they were an ally of Britain in the First World War, and Japan attacked Germany in Shandong province. I have already mentioned that in Shandong in 1898, Germany had acquired some territory. So the Germans were defeated by Japan, and Japan took over Shandong province. After that, 1915, Japan made 21 demands on the Chinese government, which basically meant that China would become a colony of Japan. Okay, they were not satisfied with whatever they had conquered, they wanted more. And the Chinese government was so much under pressure that they succumbed. They were not able to resist the Japanese because they were afraid that there will be another war and Japan will again humiliate them. And in fact, in the Republican period, China had basically, central government had lost control over China, and China had gone into the warlord period. Different territories were controlled by different warlords, and the central government had no control over them. And so China was very, very weak, and therefore they succumbed to the 21 demands, especially in Manchuria, where Japan was able to get a lot of rights, in economic rights and infrastructure, and the right to send their army there. In fact, they created a whole new army known as the Kwantung Army, okay, which was meant for fighting in Manchuria. The response was the May 4th movement, 1919. This is basically after the Treaty of Versailles. So once Germany was defeated, the victors of the war, the First World War, met in Paris. So there they signed the Treaty of Versailles, and in this treaty, the German territory of China was handed over to Japan by the Allied powers. And the Chinese were very upset because Chinese also were allies of the British, Americans and all, the other side. But they were helpless, and so students came out on the streets protesting on 4th of May 1919, demanding complete transformation of China, that China should completely change its way of life. It should adopt science instead of Confucianism and adopt democratic system of government, okay, so that the government is responsible to the people. Of course, this movement was suppressed, but in terms of ideas, it had become very popular. And an important progress was the formation of the Kuomintang. Kuomintang was a political party in China established by Sun Yat-sen. Okay, Sun Yat-sen established the Kuomintang. He already was participating in the Republican movement. In fact, he was one of the leaders of the 1911 revolution, but he had been sidelined by Yuan Shikai and other powerful military leaders. Now, Sun Yat-sen believed in three principles of the people, okay, that is nationalism, democracy and socialism, or people's livelihood, different translations. And after Sun Yat-sen died, the Kuomintang movement was then led by his successor, Chiang Kai-shek. So this was basically a culmination of the nationalist movement, Republican movement within China. The other stream of protest was the communist movement. Okay, so some of the people were actually influenced by the Russian Revolution of 1917, and they thought a similar revolution should happen in China, and China should completely uproot all the old traditions that were still prevalent in China, just like Russia did through the communist revolution. Okay, they were not happy with the reforms that Kuomintang or the liberals were suggesting. So in 1921, the Communist Party of China was formed, led by Chen Tu-shu, okay, who was the first general secretary, and Li Ta-chao. There was some difference between them, but that is not important for today's lecture's point of view. Of course, eventually one leader emerged in the Communist Party of China, who became the most powerful leader, the paramount leader, that is Mao Tse-tung. The communist revolution was basically based on Marxism, Leninism principles. Okay, let's see what happened after that. So 1921, the communist movement. So this was a period in the 1920s when there was a lot of flux. So the Kuomintang and the communists came together to revive China. Okay, and the Soviet Union had suggested that, because Soviet Union now was interfering in the politics of China, and they advised the members of the Communist Party of China to join the Kuomintang and together participate in the national movement, so that China is free from all the foreign influence and emerges as a strong state. But Chiang Kai-shek was suspicious of the communists, because obviously the communists were also under foreign influence, not the American, British or French influence, but the Soviet influence. And therefore he in 1928 launched a crackdown on the communists, and so there was a split between the Kuomintang and the communists. Now, taking advantage of that situation, Japan now decides to annex Manchuria completely. Instead of getting those rights whatever they had been given, they decide to invade Manchuria and capture it, and this happened in 1931. So the Kwantung army, which was already there in Manchuria, defeated China after a minor incident which was actually a false flag, the Mukden incident. They defeated China and captured the whole of Manchuria, and they declared formation of the state of Manchukuo. Okay, Manchu Kuo. Manchu means the people of Manchuria, Kuo means country. So, Manchu Kuo means country of the Manchus, and they invited the last Chinese emperor Pu Yi to be the emperor of Manchu Kuo, the puppet emperor. Okay, basically Japanese were the rulers, real rulers, but he was installed as the emperor. And Pu Yi was obviously overthrown in Beijing, and so he was living in exile, and so he took that opportunity and accepted the position of the ruler of Manchu Kuo. Meanwhile, I have already told you about the Soviet invasion of Xinjiang. So, many of these territories were taken over. Then in 1937, Japan was still not satisfied, because Japan had now these problems with the League of Nations, which was an international organization led by the British and the French, and they had begun to criticize Japan. But Japan was not listening to those criticisms. They had bigger ambitions. And in fact, I was talking about the sphere of influence. So, Japan had a plan of creating a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. So, their plans included controlling the whole of East Asia up to South Asia. Even India was supposed to be under their sphere of influence in this grand plan. So, as the first part of this plan, they invaded China in 1937. So, the Second World War began in Asia 2 years before Europe. In Europe, Second World War began in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, but in Asia it had already begun with the Japanese invasion of China in 1937. And I will not talk about what happened in the Second World War, it is a well known story. Eventually Japan and Germany, initially they were successful, but eventually they lost out to the might of the British Empire and Americans and the Soviets all coming together. It was too much for Japan and Germany, and they were on the verge of defeat. At that time, in 1943, British and Americans, they gave up all their extraterritorial rights in China. So, they signed agreements with the Chiang Kai-shek government, the nationalist Kuomintang government, and gave up their extraterritorial rights. So, according to Kuomintang, that is the time when century of humiliation came to an end. Of course, the World War continued till 1945 when Japan was defeated. Japan surrendered and China became independent. But soon it entered into a civil war between Kuomintang and communists. So, according to the communists, century of humiliation comes to an end not in 1943, but in 1949 when the People's Republic of China is established. 1st of October 1949, the communists capture almost entire China except for Taiwan and some islands nearby. So, the Republic of China government, so there are two governments in China. One is People's Republic of China, that is a communist government. Then there is a Republic of China which was led by Chiang Kai-shek. So, they went to Taiwan and their government was established in Taiwan. China was never able to capture Taiwan. So, Taiwan remained separate. Although the Taiwanese government, that is the Republic of China government, claims not to be the government of Taiwan, but the government of whole of China. So, this is part of the one China policy. Both the Taiwanese government as well as the Chinese government consider China to be one country, but the legitimate ruler according to the People's Republic is the Communist Party, according to the Republic of China is they themselves. Okay, now this whole saga of century of humiliation continues because Korea was part of the sphere of influence of the Chinese Empire. So, when the Americans they intervened in the war between North Korea and South Korea, North Korea being communist and South Korea being capitalist, China decides to intervene and they do very successfully in this Korean war. Okay, eventually there is no final solution to this and there is a armistice between North Korea and South Korea. So, North Korea remained in the communist bloc while South Korea joined the Americans as their ally. So, Korea was basically divided. Another part of the century of humiliation was Tibet, Tibet being independent or being under Western influence. So, in 1950 China invades Tibet. So, it defeats the Tibetans, it defeats the Dalai Lama and they capture Tibet by 1951, when Dalai Lama signed this agreement with the Chinese, giving up Tibet to China in return for autonomy. So, Tibet was supposed to be under the suzerainty of China, but the government would be that of the Tibetans under the Dalai Lama, and China or the Communist Party will not interfere in the government. But of course, the communists have nothing to do with the feudal religious institution like that of a Dalai Lama, and so gradually Chinese begin to interfere and take over power, more and more power in Tibet, and so Dalai Lama eventually escaped to India in 1959 and established the government in exile in India, and the Tibet situation continues to boil, and the Chinese, of course, they have their own policies in Tibet, and they do not recognize the Dalai Lama and his government. Now, there were some remaining elements of or remaining vestiges of colonialism in China. So, Hong Kong, which together includes Hong Kong, Kowloon and New Territories, that together they were known as Hong Kong, was still part of the British Empire. So, British continued to rule Hong Kong till 1997. So, Hong Kong had been surrendered to the British. Okay, so, Hong Kong was British territory. Kowloon also had been leased to the British in perpetuity, but the New Territories were there for only 99 years lease. So, they were given to the British in 1898. Okay, so, in 1997 the lease was supposed to expire, but without the New Territories it was almost impossible to run Hong Kong, because all their food and water supply actually came from New Territories, and so the British decided that they will give Hong Kong back to China on the condition that China will follow one country, two systems. That is, although Hong Kong will become part of China, it will not be ruled by the Communist Party, but they will have their own rule of law based system. Okay, so, what they call as basic law. So, Hong Kong has its own parliament which is partially elected, and it follows the British system of law. Okay, and it's economically also completely independent. On a similar basis, the last territory was Macau. So, Macau was under the Portuguese control. This was even a longer story of colonialism. It was there for almost, I think, 400-500 years under Portugal. It is a big center for gambling. It is like Las Vegas of Asia. So, Portugal also then gave up Macau to China in the year 2000, again based on one country, two systems. For example, in China gambling is banned, but not in Macau, because that is the source of revenue. So, Macau has its own system of government. So, in this way, one by one, China has been able to recover from its experience of colonialism. Okay. So, I told you about this part so far. So, after the communists came to power, they followed certain policies. I have mentioned them here. Let's discuss some of them. One policy was leaning on one side. Okay, Mao Zedong, after he came to power in 1949, he said that because the Soviets have helped the communists to come to power in China, in the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans, China should not remain neutral. China should lean on one side, and in return they will get all the help from the Soviet Union, and that is what happened. So, China allied with the Soviet Union initially, and Soviet Union sent hundreds of experts, and they set up hundreds of industries, and they laid the foundation of industrialization of China. So, it was a very useful policy. So, although China did not want any foreign control, but they needed Soviet Union at that stage, and so they leaned on one side. Another policy that Mao Zedong led was setting up a separate kitchen. This is a Chinese saying. So, whenever Chinese want to start something new, give up the old and start anew, they say setting up a separate kitchen. So, China wanted to be completely separate from the Republic of China. So, this then leads to the one China policy. Okay, so, if you have relation with the Republic of China, you cannot have relation with the People's Republic of China. You have to choose one of the Chinas. You have to choose either Beijing or Taipei. You cannot choose both. Okay, so many countries they recognize Beijing and not Taipei, but United States of America recognize Taipei till 1979. Okay, so they took that risk. Chinese took that risk of some countries not recognizing them, but eventually the reality was People's Republic of China controlled most of China, and Taiwan is just a small island. So, it is more powerful than Taiwan eventually. And so, today basically it is less than 20, I think it keeps on changing the numbers. So, right now maybe 17 countries recognize Taipei, and the rest of the world, that is almost 180 countries, recognize Beijing as the legitimate government. So, this was also a successful policy. Another policy that Mao Zedong adopted was cleaning the house before inviting the guests. That is, all the foreign assets were ordered to leave China, all the foreigners were ordered to leave China, all the foreign companies were ordered to leave China. So, China said that we will start anew, we will clean the house, we will remove all imperial influences, and if in the future we require foreigners to come, then we will invite them, once we have full control over our own country on our own terms. And this happened in 1978 onwards, when China, after following a very autarkic policy under Mao, opened up. They opened China for foreign investments and so on and so forth. So, and in fact that was very useful. After 78, China has grown economically. It has become now the second largest economy in the world, and eventually it seems that they might become the largest economy in the world. Already mentioned one China policy. In 1972, Zhou Enlai took a lead in this, when he convinced the Americans to have good relations with China in order to counter the Soviet Union. Then in 2005, Hu Jintao, he passed a law, anti-secession law, declaring that Taiwan has no right to declare independence, and if it does, China can use non-peaceful means to reunite Taiwan with China. Okay. So, China has no right to declare itself to be independent, although it has its own government, it has its own army, own navy, own air force. It's a richer country than China, it is technologically more advanced than China, but it has no right to declare itself to be independent. And if it does, China will use non-peaceful means. Okay. So, that is the one China policy. I already discussed one country, two systems with regards to Hong Kong and Macau. So, these are some of the responses of China to imperialism, or what they call as century of humiliation. Now, the interesting thing is this concept of humiliation. So, China perhaps is a unique country in the world which looks at its history, a particular period in history, and identifies it for humiliation. So, all these things are taught to Chinese students from a very early age. They are taught that the Western powers, the foreigners came to China, humiliated China, insulted China. China used to be the greatest power on earth, and they came and humiliated China. So, Chinese should hate these foreign powers, powers like Japan, like the European powers, America, even India, because as I mentioned, they participated in some of these wars against China. So, Chinese develop a sense of ultra nationalism because of this whole narrative of century of humiliation. In India, we do not see this type of a discourse. In India, the discourse is more about, say, survival. Okay, it's like that we have survived so many invasions, India still stands. So, it is not a sense of humiliation, there is no sense of urgency, there is no sense of teaching the foreigners a lesson. There is nothing like that in India. In India, we say, okay, we survived. But in China, it is not like that. China wants to reassert itself. It wants to again become the middle kingdom, the most powerful nation on earth, and its whole policy is oriented towards this. Now, connected to this century of humiliation is the concept of rise and fall of great powers. China looks at the world through a kind of a lens of how a country rises to power and gradually how it declines. What things lead to a rise of a country and what things lead to decline of a country. And the Communist Party organized study sessions on this particular thing. There were presentations by experts on this particular topic. All the leaders of Communist Party were present, and they studied different countries of the world, how they became powerful and how they declined. They were so impressed by these presentations that they made a documentary, I think 10 episode or I think 12 episode documentary called The Rise of Great Powers. It is available in YouTube, it is in Chinese. You can watch that. You will understand even if it is in Chinese, because there are a lot of pictures and all the stuff. So, the Chinese are able to identify what the positives or the strengths of each of these powers were, and how it is in comparison to China's own experience of century of humiliation. for the sake of discussion, let's look at some of these points. Okay, these are just points of discussion. These are not, say, facts. These are opinions. So, Portugal and Spain. Portugal and Spain were the first hegemonic powers in the world. They began their hegemonic journey through maritime exploration. So, there was a competition between Portugal and Spain to control more and more colonies, and they almost came to a war. Both were Catholic countries. So, the Pope invited the rulers of these two countries, and he divided the world into two parts. One part was given to, this is in the Treaty of Tordesillas. Okay, in this treaty, the Pope divided the world into two parts. So, what today you can say is the Americas, except Brazil, the rest of America is all considered to be part of the Spanish sphere of influence, while Africa and Asia was given to Portugal. And so for example, in India, it is the Portuguese who began colonization, like in Goa, they remain in Daman and Diu and so on, they remain. Even China, I mentioned, they were there. Spain never came to Africa and Asia, except Philippines, because from the other side they took over Philippines. But except that, Spain never colonized and say Western Sahara in Africa. Spain never really colonized Africa and Asia because it was given to Portugal. The strength of Portugal and Spain was their navy, their shipbuilding, their maritime assets. Now, when China looks at this, it remembers Zheng He. Zheng He was the great Chinese admiral who from 1405 to 1434 built these huge ships, okay, much bigger than the Portuguese and Spanish ships, and he explored different parts of Asia and Africa, built connections with them, threatened some of the rulers, overthrew some governments. Okay, so China was actually capable of becoming a colonial power, but the Confucian elite, the Mandarins in China, did not want that. They feared that the people like Zheng He would become more powerful, the military will become more powerful. As a result, they will lose the control over the government. And so, eventually, shipbuilding was banned in China. So, China, large ships could not be built. Chinese people were prohibited from traveling too far in the sea. Okay, so this was a kind of an inward looking approach. This is under the Ming dynasty. So, the Chinese people regret that if China had continued on the path of Zheng He, then before Portugal and before Spain, China would have emerged as the hegemonic power in the world. So, China missed an opportunity here, and so China does not want to miss that opportunity again. So, China is building a blue water navy, a navy that can go anywhere in the world now. Then from Netherlands, the concept of Protestant capitalism, Protestant ethic. Okay, Netherlands is a Protestant country which is based on hard work. The power of the church is limited there, and so the people are allowed to make money. And after Portugal and Spain, Netherlands emerged as a hegemonic power in the world. It defeated Portugal in different wars and emerged as the number one hegemonic power. It's a tiny country, very small. Still, it was able to conquer the world, so to say. Because of its policies, because of its banking system, because of its financial system, because of the hard work of its people, it was able to emerge as the number one power in the world. So, the Chinese also want to adopt what is known as, you can say some people use different terms, but it's a form of capitalism which is based on Chinese values, which in fact they don't like to call it capitalism, they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. But some scholars call it Confucian capitalism, okay, which is again based on certain values, certain Chinese values. Okay. Then the Britain. So after Netherlands, the next number one power is Britain, the British Empire, through constitutionalism, by establishing a constitutional form of government, by controlling the power of the king and parliament taking over power. Britain emerged as the number one power, defeated the Dutch. And then they went under two industrializations. First industrial revolution of the late 18th century and the second industrial revolution of the mid 19th century. As a result, Britain became the most powerful country in the world. So, therefore, China also emphasizes on industrialization. Today, China is the largest industrial power in the world. Okay, so they are emulating the British in this path. The French. The French became powerful due to wars and revolutions. The French Revolution is very famous. Napoleon is very famous for conquering large parts of Europe. So China also has this history of revolutions, and so China takes some inspiration from France as well. Germany became a powerful country because of unification. Germany used to be divided into very small states. So by 1871, Germany was reunified by Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. He reunified Germany within 10 years, and then Germany became the most powerful country in Europe that was able to challenge the whole world in the First World War and the Second World War. Of course, the Chinese learned from the mistakes also. The mistake was the Germans were too ambitious. Bismarck was cautious, but after Bismarck was dismissed in 1890, he was forced to resign by the ambitious Kaiser William II, who wanted to overtake the British, and as a result led Germany into the First World War. Similarly, Hitler also was very ambitious, too ambitious. He fought against all the countries of the world, and so eventually he was defeated. So China is very cautious. Therefore, China follows what is known as the concept of peaceful rise. As you can see here, concept of peaceful rise. Rise in such a way that you don't threaten anyone. Quietly, slowly, gradually acquire more and more power, and don't become like Germany and Japan, because they threatened the world. As a result, the world destroyed them. Okay. From Japan, of course, reform and modernization, the Meiji Restoration is a very important source of inspiration for China. From the Tsarist Russia, it's expansionism. Russia is the largest territorial country in the world. So that is because they expanded, they acquired more and more territory. So China also believes in expanding more and more in terms of land territory, and so this Belt and Road Initiative is all about getting access to more and more territory, building infrastructure in more and more countries. Americans became great because of their individual freedom, American dream, the dream of becoming the greatest on earth. Okay, so Chinese President Xi Jinping, when he started his tenure, he also declared that there is a Chinese dream. Okay, so China also has the ambition of becoming number one in the world. Of course, the Soviet Union, which no longer exists, China drew a lot of inspiration from the Soviet Union also. Okay, so it's very interesting the way the Chinese people understand imperialism, the way they create this discourse of century of humiliation, which incite a sense of ultra nationalism in China, and then they have this strategic thinking of how countries rise to power and how they decline, and how to avoid the mistakes that were made by other countries in the past, and how to learn from the strengths of these countries and make China great again. Okay. Thank you very much. So I stop here. See you in the next lecture. Hello, welcome to a 20-hour course on Introduction to Chinese Studies. I am Swayam Sharma, Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations. I am right now working in the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences in Chanakya University, Bengaluru. Before that, I worked as Assistant Professor of Political Science at Rajiv Gandhi National University of Law, Punjab. I have done my Chinese studies from the Center for East Asian Studies in School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. I have used my experience of studying about China, visiting China, interacting with Indian experts on China as well as Chinese scholars to develop this particular course, which has total 20 lectures. Let me go through some of them. briefly discuss them. The first is Origins of Chinese Civilization, which basically discusses how the Chinese civilization started, what were the ideas and the situations that led to the emergence of China as a civilization. Second lecture deals with Mandate of Heaven. Mandate of Heaven is a concept that the Chinese developed about 3000 years ago, which says that the rule of a particular dynasty is not permanent. The right to rule depends on the virtue of the ruler. So long as ruler is ruling according to the desire of heaven, which is the cosmic law, it can remain in power. But once it deviates from that, it will lose power and a new dynasty will replace it. So that is the concept of Mandate of Heaven, and that has been a justification used by different dynasties that have come to power in China. Number 3 is Confucianism. Confucianism has been the official ideology of the Chinese state for more than 2000 years. It was only replaced in 1911 after the revolution by the Republic of China. So till then, Confucianism had remained the official ideology of the Chinese state. So it is very important to understand Confucianism in order to understand China. Then the fourth lecture is on schools of ancient Chinese thought. So besides Confucianism, there are other schools also. So this particular lecture goes into that: legalism, Taoism, and so on and so forth. Number 5 is on religion in China. So it discusses the religious ideas as it emerged in China, and then the impact of Buddhism and the different forms of Buddhism in China, and also the impact of Islam and Christianity on China. The sixth lecture has 2 parts. One is religious administration in China. So religion is regulated in China by the state and the party, and so this particular aspect deals with the religious administration in China. And the second part is scientific thought in China. So how scientific thought has emerged in China since the ancient times, and why China was not able to remain at the top, why the West overtook China. So these are some of the questions that we examine in this particular part. And we also discuss the contemporary situation. What is the contemporary thinking of the Chinese government towards scientific knowledge? The 7th and 8th lectures deal with Century of Humiliation. This is a discourse on imperialism in China. So the Chinese people believe that China has been exploited by Western powers, and especially from the middle of the 19th century up to the middle of the 20th century. So what happened during this period? That is the subject matter of these 2 lectures. Then we have Mao Zedong thought. Mao, the founder of the People's Republic of China. So his thought is very important to understand how the Chinese Communist Party state came into existence and what were the ideas that inspired it in the beginning, and then how it got transformed. The next lecture, Transition of China to Market Socialism, deals with the transformation of China after the death of Mao in 1976 and up to say 1989, how China transformed itself into a market economy. The next 2 lectures, 11th and 12th, they deal with the Chinese political system. So China is ruled by the Communist Party, and so what is the system that it follows? It is different from the constitutional system in democratic countries like United States or India. Then the next 4 lectures deal with India-China relations. So the first one begins in the ancient times, say 300 BC, and continues till 1949. So it contains the boundary dispute between India and China also. Then the next one, 1949 to 62, deals with the period of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai and the 1962 war. Then we move on to the period from 62 to 93, when there were some conflicts, but there were also some attempts to making peace between the 2 countries. And then the last one is about the rise of China and rise of India, and how the competition between the 2 countries is playing out in the international system. Thank you.